The man was not chosen because he was exceptional. He was chosen because he was reliable. At the time, he was a low-ranking soldier with no political influence, no public profile, and no reason to believe his actions would ever be examined beyond the immediate moment. That anonymity made him suitable. According to his later account, the order did not come with explanation. It was delivered briefly, without ideological framing or emotional language. There was no speech about history, no justification about necessity. It was presented as a task, not a decision. Something already resolved elsewhere. He understood immediately what the name meant. Che Guevara was not an abstract enemy. He was a symbol recognized far beyond Bolivia. The soldier later explained that this recognition made the order feel heavier, not because of admiration, but because of consequence. Whatever happened next would not remain confined to the room where the order was given. The instruction was clear. There would be no trial, no delay, no transfer. The situation was described as unstable, and instability, he was told, required resolution. The language was administrative, not violent. That distinction mattered. It reframed the act as procedure rather than execution. The soldier recalled that no one asked for confirmation. No one checked his reaction. The assumption was obedience. In the structure he operated within, questions were interpreted as resistance, and resistance was not tolerated. Compliance was expected, not negotiated. What troubled him most was not fear of punishment if he refused. It was the absence of alternatives. The order was delivered as the only available option. There was no mention of higher authority, but the implication was unmistakable. This decision had already passed through layers he would never access. He did not know Che Guevara personally. He had never spoken to him. Yet the weight of the order came from understanding what Che represented to others. Killing him would not end a mission. It would end a narrative. The soldier understood that he was being positioned at the final point of a process that began long before Che was captured. He later described a moment of hesitation, but not defiance. It was the realization that once carried out, the act could never be recontextualized. There would be no explanation that made it smaller. There would be no version of events where his role disappeared entirely. Despite this awareness, the order remained unchanged. There was no opportunity to defer it to someone else. There was no rotation of responsibility. The expectation was personal. The soldier was to act alone and quickly. In the hours that followed, he did not speak to anyone about the order. Silence was not imposed. It was assumed. Discussing it would have implied doubt, and doubt was dangerous. He prepared not as someone about to commit an extraordinary act, but as someone following routine under unusual circumstances. What he did not know at the time was that this silence would extend far beyond that day. It would shape the rest of his life. The order would be carried out, but the consequences would not end when the task was completed. For decades, the soldier said nothing. Not to family, not to colleagues, not even to himself in words. The act was isolated in his memory, sealed off from explanation. Speaking would not undo it, and remaining silent felt safer than confronting its meaning. In the next part, we will examine what happened after the order was given, how the moment unfolded, and why the man who carried it out chose to disappear into silence for the rest of his life. The soldier later explained that the time between receiving the order and carrying it out was not marked by chaos or urgency, but by an unnatural calm. There was no countdown, no dramatic preparation, and no visible tension among those around him. This absence of intensity made the situation more unsettling. It suggested that what was about to occur had already been accepted as inevitable. Che Guevara was being held under guard, wounded and physically weakened. The soldier was aware of this condition, and it complicated the meaning of the order. He was not being sent into combat. There would be no exchange of fire, no immediate threat. The task required proximity, not aggression. This distinction removed any sense of self-defense and forced the soldier to confront the nature of the act directly. When he entered the room, there was no formal acknowledgement. No final statement was read. No witnesses were assembled. The environment was deliberately ordinary. The soldier later emphasized that this ordinariness was not accidental. It minimized the moment, reducing it to something procedural rather than historic. Che Guevara, according to the account, was aware of what was coming. He did not attempt negotiation or appeal. He did not ask for intervention or delay. His demeanor did not reflect surprise. The soldier recalled that Che's posture and expression conveyed recognition rather than resistance. This recognition altered the dynamic of the encounter. The soldier stated that Che spoke briefly. The words were not ideological and did not reference the revolution. They were practical, direct, and personal. Che acknowledged the situation and addressed the soldier not as an enemy, but as an individual placed within a structure he did not control. This framing removed distance and replaced it with immediacy. What followed was not described as a struggle. There was no attempt to dramatize the act in retrospect. The soldier emphasized that the absence of resistance did not make the act easier. It made it heavier. Without conflict, there was nothing to justify the action as necessity. It was an execution carried out in silence. Afterward, there was no reaction from those present that suggested relief or celebration. The atmosphere remained controlled. Instructions were given about what to report and how to frame the event. The soldier was not congratulated. He was not reassured. He was simply expected to return to his position and resume routine. This response reinforced what he had already understood. The act was not meant to be remembered as a personal decision. It was meant to dissolve into a narrative shaped elsewhere. His role was functional, not symbolic. The significance of the event would be managed by others. In the hours that followed, the soldier experienced a growing awareness of separation. The moment he had just participated in was already being transformed into something distant and abstract. Reports were written. Messages were transmitted. The language used removed proximity and emotion. Che Guevara became a historical figure again, no longer a presence in the room. The soldier later described this process as erasure through administration. By controlling how the event was described, the institution controlled how it would be remembered. There was no space for ambiguity or personal testimony. The official version did not require witnesses who could speak independently. This understanding shaped the soldier's decision to remain silent. Speaking would not challenge the narrative. It would only isolate him. The act had already been absorbed into a structure that did not acknowledge individual experience. What remained was memory without outlet. The soldier carried not only the memory of the act itself, but the memory of how quickly it was transformed into something impersonal. This transformation, he said, was more disturbing than the moment of execution. In the next part, we will examine how the soldier lived with this silence, how it affected his life in the years that followed, and what ultimately led him to break that silence decades later. In the years that followed, the soldier did not receive recognition, protection, or reassurance. He returned to anonymity almost immediately. The institution that had relied on his obedience had no further use for his presence. What remained was not a sense of completion, but a prolonged state of unresolved responsibility. He did not speak about the event to his family. Silence was not imposed by threat, but by understanding. Explaining what he had done would have required context he could not safely provide. Without that context, the act would appear either monstrous or incomprehensible. Neither interpretation felt survivable. The soldier later described how the memory settled into his daily life. It did not appear as a constant image, but as an awareness. It shaped his reactions, his relationships, and his sense of distance from others. He avoided positions of authority. He resisted roles that required command. Obedience had once defined him. Afterward, it became something he distrusted. He was aware that the official narrative surrounding Che Guevara's death had stabilized quickly. Public accounts were consistent and definitive. There was no space within them for personal recollection. The soldier recognized that any deviation from this narrative would be perceived not as clarification, but as disruption. This understanding reinforced his silence. Speaking would not correct the record. It would challenge a version of events that had already been institutionalized. The cost of that challenge would fall entirely on him. As time passed, The urgency of the act faded, but its presence did not. The soldier aged alongside a history that no longer needed him. New generations encountered the story as something finished, something resolved. He encountered it as something ongoing, carried internally without acknowledgement. Occasionally, fragments of the past resurfaced through external reminders. Anniversaries, documentaries, public discussions. Each time, the soldier experienced a renewed sense of separation. The figure described publicly bore little resemblance to the man he had encountered. The narrative had removed proximity, leaving behind abstraction. He did not seek absolution. He did not frame himself as a victim. When he later spoke, he emphasized that his silence was not an attempt to escape responsibility. It was an acceptance of how responsibility functioned within the system he had served. Once the order was carried out, there was no mechanism for personal reckoning. The soldier's life continued, outwardly unremarkable. He worked, aged, and withdrew. The event did not define him publicly, but it defined the boundaries of his inner life. Certain questions were avoided. Certain memories were left untouched. Silence became habitual rather than conscious. What eventually altered this equilibrium was not guilt, but time. Distance weakened the structures that once demanded silence. Authority changed hands. The urgency that once justified suppression diminished. The soldier began to recognize that his silence no longer protected stability. It only preserved absence. In the next part, we will examine why he finally chose to speak, what conditions made that decision possible, and how his testimony reshaped the understanding of what happened after the order was given. The soldier did not decide to speak because he believed it would change history. By the time he broke his silence, history had already settled into its shape. The narrative surrounding Che Guevara's death was complete, repeated, and widely accepted. There was no expectation that his testimony would alter public understanding in any meaningful way. What changed was the cost of silence. As decades passed, the structures that once required obedience weakened. The authority that had framed the order as unavoidable no longer held the same weight. The soldier understood that remaining silent no longer served the system. It only preserved a gap between what was known and what was said. He did not come forward to accuse, justify, or absolve himself. His account was restrained. He described the order as it was delivered, the absence of explanation, and the procedural nature of the act. He did not assign blame beyond the structure itself. Responsibility, in his view, was diffuse by design. What his testimony introduced was not a new version of events, but a missing dimension. It restored proximity to a moment that had been flattened into abstraction. It reminded listeners that decisions described historically as necessary are carried out by individuals who live with their consequences long after the moment has passed. The soldier emphasized that he was not unique. Others had received orders, followed instructions, and remained silent. His story was not meant to stand apart, but to represent how systems distribute responsibility until no single voice feels authorized to speak. By finally breaking his silence, he did not claim moral clarity. He acknowledged uncertainty. He acknowledged compliance. And he acknowledged the absence of alternatives as they were presented to him at the time. This testimony does not transform the event into something more dramatic. It makes it quieter and more unsettling. It reveals how historical endings are often managed through procedure rather than confrontation, and how silence becomes an extension of authority long after commands are issued. The order was given. It was carried out. And for decades it required no explanation, until someone finally spoke.